So at this time, we're going to jump into the second part of our learning tonight, which is talking very briefly about technology. It is so very interesting to work on this topic area in consideration of how quickly over the past year and a half people have had to educators, I should say, have had to move towards a very brisk pace of learning to learn as much as they possibly could about how technology could be used to foster learning. And I just said educators, but I will also say students and also parents as well have had to learn a great deal about technology. And so I want you to now be familiar. This used to be a somewhat shorter, small, just very small piece of this lecture on session 4 in my past years of teaching this course. But I believe that due to COVID and due to so many things, teachers have really taken in the potential of how technology could be used in the classroom to a much greater extent than it ever has. And I believe the lasting impact of COVID will be that we will see a much heightened sense of the use of technology. This use of technology will be used in a few ways, because some of these things teachers had not discovered, and now that they're, acclimated to it and they feel comfortable with it, I really believe that these things are going to stick around. I know at least for the upcoming several years, because of COVID, the lack of access to education that some of our students have had, we're going to need to find dynamic ways to work with students, even in smaller groups. And I don't anticipate class sizes just dropping dramatically. So we have to get savvy and we have to get smart in thinking about how can I work with all of my students effectively? How can I work with some of my students effectively? And how can I work with students one-on-one? So in creating that dynamic kind of classroom where we make opportunities or create opportunities where we're at times working with all students, learners, we're working with small groups of learners, and we're working with students one-on-one, we're gonna need to think a little bit differently. And we're going to need to lean on technology a little bit more. I'm not sure how familiar you are with some of these tools, and some of you may have some really deep knowledge about some of the tools and some of the ideas and concepts I'm going to present. So I'm going to give you a little bit of wiggle room here to be able to access the printable slides, to click on some of these links to experience what I would say are a few of my top choices when it comes to creating that dynamic classroom for students. So in the last video, I introduced you to Padlet and I introduced you to ThingLink. I want to also make sure you are familiar, not just for this course, but you are familiar for educational purposes as a whole with these 3 top used platforms for moving learning online to free up a little bit of yourself in order to work with small groups and one-on-one with students. The 3 links I'm providing you with are Nearpod, Seesaw, and Flipgrid. Each of them perform similar functions, and each of those could be infused into your classroom in a station of sorts, to somewhat replicate yourself so that you can be doing more than one thing at a time. A concept that has gained some momentum in the use of technology is the concept of a flipped classroom. And I'll present some of the hesitations teachers have about a flipped classroom, but I do want to make sure I've introduced this to you. These slides were actually borrowed from a colleague of mine who does an amazing job of explaining flipped classroom and uses the concept of flipped classroom quite a bit. And so much of this I am not going to actually read through to you, but I do want you to clearly understand this concept for your own personal use by reading through these slides. So to begin with, it shows you in this slide what the concept of a flipped classroom is. Essentially, it's where we think of homework being done at home and the learning, being done at home in lieu of homework, and the actual work where students have someone there to ask questions of, to collaborate with others, to confer with the teacher one-on-one is the part that's done live. Some teachers kind of not frown in a joking manner when the concept of flipped classroom came about. People, one of the first thoughts was, oh my goodness, this has the potential for canceling all snow days, because we could actually provide a format where students can always be learning in this flipped classroom kind of environment. In COVID, we created kind of a flipped classroom where students, during my experience with COVID, we would place things online for students to learn, and then we would have designated times to Zoom with the class to discuss the learnings that took place when they were learning remotely. So these slides show you a little bit about, again, I'm not going to read these to you, but these slides do show you a little bit about how the concept of flipped classroom can work. Again, the benefit of flipped classroom in a social studies classroom is that the portion of time when students are listening to you lecture or taking in information is done at home so that you can work with them in class. This slide provides you a little bit of the pros and cons. Perhaps you'll see over on the cons side a few of the things that you might be wondering about as you hear, or if you're newly introduced to this concept, that you may be questioning yourself. There are definite things that we have to think about inside of a flipped classroom concept. In order to address some of the biggest concerns, you're going to want to take a moment to read through and to look at some of the information that I have provided on these slides. Here is, I thought, a very good mnemonic in order to kind of think about what are the non-negotiables inside of a flipped classroom. What makes it work most effectively? This can't should be turned into a can, definitely, but this is how it can work inside of your classroom. Next, I'm going to provide you with some slides that explain Google Classroom. So flipped classrooms and videos need to be stored or housed somewhere for your social studies teaching. You must become familiar with Google Classroom. Most school districts use Google and moved to Google Classroom. And I believe this is going to hang around after COVID. So it would be very important for you to understand the concept, or not concept, I'm sorry, the structure of Google Classroom. I have also provided you with some kind of a little bit of a cheat sheet of how to create your own Google Classroom. If you're not familiar with it, I would suggest you take time to explore this. Inside of a job interview, you may not be asked the intricacies of how to assign a class, but I would imagine on a job interview, they will be asking you some questions about the use of technology, as again, it's going to hang around long after COVID in order for us to lift up these students. And an essential question is, so now that I have this time, what do I get to do with the extra class hours that I have because I've freed up so much time? That information will come when we talk, when we all come back together and we talk about some of the important work inside of geography and economics concepts, as well as the use of different types of text beyond the layered text, but actual text in your classroom.